The Soviet Union entered the Second World War with one of the largest air forces in the world and lost most of it within days. What followed was a painful but determined recovery that transformed Soviet aviation from collapse to dominance over the Eastern Front. We start with air superiority fighters. Polikarpov I-16. The I-16 was the primary Soviet fighter when Germany invaded in June 1941. Once considered modern when it entered service in 1934, it was completely outclassed by the Bf-109 by the time war began. Soviet pilots flew it in desperate defensive battles during Operation Barbarossa. Over 10,000 were produced. It served as the backbone of the VVS in the opening chaos of the war. Polikarpov I-153. The I-153 was a biplane fighter still in active frontline service when Germany invaded. Designed in the late 1930s, it featured a retractable undercarriage, an unusual detail for a biplane, and could carry rockets beneath its wings. Against modern Bf-109s, it had no realistic chance. Like the I-16, it was used in the desperate defensive air battles of 1941 before being withdrawn. MiG-3. The MiG-3 was designed as a high-altitude interceptor and entered service in 1940. Above 5,000 meters, it was fast and capable. Below that altitude, where most Eastern Front combat actually occurred, it handled poorly and was difficult to fly. Production was cut short in late 1941, with around 3,300 built. Engine resources were redirected to the Il-2, which was considered a higher priority. Yakovlev Yak-1. The Yak-1 was the first Soviet fighter capable of competing with German opponents on reasonable terms. Entering service in 1940, it was lighter and more maneuverable than the MiG-3 and performed well at low to medium altitudes where most fighting happened. Approximately 8,700 were produced. It became the starting point for the entire Yak fighter family that would define Soviet air power through the rest of the war. Yakovlev Yak-9. The Yak-9 was the most produced Soviet fighter of the entire war, with over 16,700 built. Entering combat in late 1942, it served in multiple configurations: anti-tank, long-range escort, and standard interceptor. Its light airframe made it adaptable. The Yak-9D variant carried extended fuel tanks for escort missions deep into enemy territory. It remained in frontline service from Stalingrad through to the final offensives of 1945. Yakovlev Yak-3. The Yak-3 was the lightest and arguably the most effective dogfighter in the Soviet inventory. Introduced in 1944, it was optimized for low-altitude performance and outmaneuvered most opponents it encountered below 5,000 meters. German pilots were reportedly instructed to avoid combat with it at those altitudes. Over 4,800 were built. The French volunteer Normandie-Niemen Regiment flew it with considerable distinction. Lavochkin Lag-3. The Lag-3 entered service in 1941 and was quickly criticized for being underpowered and heavy. Built primarily from wood composite materials, Soviet pilots gave it a grim nickname that played on its initials, calling it a guaranteed lacquered coffin. Despite its poor reputation, over 6,500 were built. It served as a necessary stopgap during the darkest period of the war and directly led to the development of the much better La-5. Lavochkin La-5. The La-5 was a turning point for Soviet fighter aviation. Engineers replaced the Lag-3's troubled inline engine with a more powerful Shvetsov radial, producing an aircraft with dramatically better performance. Introduced in mid-1942, it could compete with the Bf-109F and Focke-Wulf 190 on nearly equal terms. It arrived in time for the Battle of Stalingrad and became one of the symbols of Soviet air recovery. Lavochkin La-7. The La-7 was the refined successor to the La-5, entering frontline service in 1944. Faster, better armed, and more reliable than its predecessor, It represented the peak of Soviet piston-engine fighter development. Ivan Kozydub, the leading Allied ace of the entire war, with 62 confirmed victories, scored many of his kills in the La-7. Over 5,700 were produced before the war ended in Europe. Moving on to ground attack aircraft. Aviation Il-2. The Il-2 Sturmovik was the most important Soviet combat aircraft of the war. Heavily armored and designed to absorb ground fire, it carried cannons, rockets, and bombs against German armor and infantry. Stalin famously demanded its production be treated as vital as bread. Over 36,000 were built, making it the most produced military aircraft in history. Nothing else shaped the Eastern Front Air War quite like the Il-2. Aviation Il-10. The Il-10 was the direct successor to the Il-2, entering service in late 1944. It was faster, better armored, and carried improved armament, including a rear-facing defensive cannon operated by a gunner. Though it arrived too late to serve extensively in the European theater, it saw combat in the final Soviet offensives and in the brief campaign against Japan in August 1945. Over 4,500 were eventually built. Sukhoi Su-2. The Su-2 was a light bomber designed for close support and short-range reconnaissance. Entering service in 1940, it performed reasonably well in its intended role, but was highly vulnerable without fighter escort. It served extensively in the early years of the war on the Eastern Front, flying reconnaissance and ground attack missions. Around 900 were built before production was discontinued in favor of more capable designs. Petlyakov P-2. The P-2 was the standard Soviet fast bomber and dive bomber throughout the war. Originally conceived as a high-altitude fighter, it was redesigned as a bomber and proved remarkably capable. Fast enough to often evade German interceptors, it carried up to 1,600 kilograms of bombs. Nearly 11,500 were built across numerous variants, making it one of the most important Soviet aircraft of the conflict from 1941 onward. Tupolev Tu-2. The Tu-2 was a twin-engine medium bomber widely regarded as one of the finest aircraft in its class during the war. Entering operational service in 1942, it was fast, well-armed defensively, and capable of carrying a heavy bomb load. It served in level bombing, dive bombing, and torpedo attack roles. Around 2,500 were completed during the war years, and it continued in Soviet service well into the post-war period. Aviation Il-4. The Il-4 was the primary Soviet long-range bomber of the war, originally designated WWII. Soviet aircraft flying this type conducted the first bombing raids on Berlin in August 1941. It served in strategic bombing, maritime torpedo attacks against German shipping in the Baltic and Black Sea, and supply missions to partisan units operating behind enemy lines. Over 5,000 were produced, and it served from the first day to the last. Next are reconnaissance and patrol aircraft. Polikarpov R-5. The R-5 was a biplane reconnaissance and light bomber that was already considered outdated before the war began. A design from the late 1920s, it remained in limited service during the early years of the Eastern Front, used for short-range reconnaissance, artillery spotting, and liaison work. It also flew supply missions to partisan units operating behind German lines. Frontline service ended by 1943 as more capable aircraft took its place. Now we look at transport and utility aircraft. Lisanov Li-2. The Li-2 was the Soviet military's primary transport aircraft throughout the war. It was a licensed Soviet-built version of the American Douglas DC-3, produced from 1939 onward, with modifications for military use. It carried troops, supplies, and equipment across the vast Eastern Front, conducted paratroop drops, and flew resupply missions to partisan units deep behind German lines. Over 4,900 were produced in the Soviet Union during the war years. Next come trainer aircraft. Yakovlev UT-2. The UT-2 was the standard Soviet basic trainer used to prepare pilots throughout the war. A single-engine low-wing monoplane. It provided the fundamental flying skills required before pilots could advance to combat aircraft. As the Soviet Union rapidly expanded its pilot training programs, following the catastrophic losses of 1941, the UT-2 became a central part of that effort. Thousands of VVS pilots completed their early training on this aircraft.